Today's topic is really broad. So we want to first kind of try to set the baseline on gaining a better understanding of how immigration really does impact not only our local economy and our state economy, but our national economy. So we'll start there and see where this conversation takes us. We have three guests who each bring a unique lens to the conversation. We have policy, legal, and really lived experience represented on our stage. And let me introduce you to our wonderful panel members. First of all, down on the end here, we have Annie Athar. She is a board member at Grassroots Leadership with a focus on deportation issues. Annie was born in Pakistan, and she was a youth leader in immigration rights. Her family was put in removal proceedings while applying for asylum. And just this past fall, I understand that Annie's family won their case after 24 years of residency. So talk about perspective. Next to Annie is Chris Wallace. He is the president of the Texas Association of Business, the state Chamber of Commerce, in essence. TAB represents companies from the largest multinational corporations to small businesses in nearly every community in the big state of Texas, and they work to improve the Texas business climate and help make our state's economy one of the strongest in the world. Finally, next to me, we have Faye Colley. Faye is an attorney with DMCA. She practices in the area of business and employment-based immigration. She speaks on business immigration issues all across this region and frequently provides comments to the state legislature. And immigration was a hot topic in this past legislative session. So thank you all for giving us your time this morning. We want to jump right in, and I want to begin with something from the American Immigration Council to kind of set the stage. Immigrants now account for 1 in 6 Texans and support the economy in a growing number of industries as workers, business owners, taxpayers, and neighbors. Immigrants are an integral part of the state's diverse and thriving communities. So I want to begin with a question to all of you. Angelos Angelou released a study just last month that showed removing undocumented immigrants would decrease the Texas GDP by $78 billion over 10 years. From your varying perspectives, tell us about this connection between a thriving economy and the immigrant community. Why don't you start with that one, Chris, since this is your area of expertise.
Thank you, Judy, and good morning. It's great to be with you this morning again. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to each of you. It's good to be with my fellow panelists. Judy, I'm happy that you started with the economic impact study from Angelos. I was just with him last night at a reception, at the Consul General's reception. And I was visiting with him about, this is probably one of the most recent studies that we've seen in several months. And it is very significant because it really focuses on the economic impact. What if we did not have particularly undocumented immigrants in Texas today? What would our economy face? And I think that's a good discussion for us to have and start with this morning, because so many people think that, one, they're not needed. And our economy could thrive without them, that they are a drain on our economy. We've heard all of this. That is simply not true. Let me give you some examples of this study. $703 million fiscal surplus from its undocumented immigrant populations, what Angelo says for Texas today. That's what we generate, $703 million fiscal surplus. Now, the report also finds that $2 billion in public services, $2 billion in public services from the state, while paying $2.7 billion in various consumption, utility, and property taxes. So undocumented immigrants pay $2.7 billion in consumption, utility, and property taxes. And a lot of people think that they do not pay taxes. I've been on numerous panels, numerous speaking engagements around the state, and we hear even business leaders say that, well, they don't pay taxes. They're a drain on the economy. That's simply not true. They buy things, they buy homes, they buy cars, they rent facilities, they rent apartments. All of that is through their lease. They actually do pay taxes, a lot of taxes. Some of them don't get that back, like a lot of us get it back through Social Security and other forms. So I think that's a very good point for us to consider this morning. As Judy said, 1.65 million undocumented immigrants call Texas home today. And furthermore, he goes on, Angelos goes on in the study to say, if we did not have them today, so if they were not in the construction, if they were not in the agriculture, if they were not in our service industry, which is primarily where you see a lot of undocumented immigrants and their valuable workers that they have in those industries, it is a $78 billion loss to the GDP of our state. $78 billion loss. So if some say, and a lot of political leadership says, well, ship them home. $78 billion loss in Texas GDP. So I think that's a good way to start and frame our discussion this morning is that, one, it's the wrong thing to do as a human being. It's unnecessary, just like many other pieces of legislation we saw in the last state session. It's unnecessary legislation with what we did with SB 4. It's not needed today. We did it anyway. So if we keep going down this path, these are the types, particularly on the federal level, these are the types of ramifications we're going to face not only as a country but as a state. And it's a huge impact to our business community.
And I think we're going to talk more about maybe the DREAM Act and some other legislation on the national level. But Annie, from your perspective, let's talk about immigration and the economy from a more personal level, not the big picture.
Yeah, so I did spend about 3.5 years as the Texas director of an organization called Forward US, which is a bipartisan immigration reform group. And Forward is known for mobilizing especially business leaders and technology companies around the issue of immigration reform. So in addition to my personal story, one of the things that I wanted to mention was that what the trend we're seeing nationally with this new administration is that it's legal immigration is getting harder. And so if you have, certain kinds of opinions about undocumented immigrants, we can, Chris gave a really great statistics on how they do impact our economy and our livelihood in the state. But when legal immigration gets harder, that also puts an economic burden on especially cities like Austin, which rely on highly skilled immigrants to come work here and to build companies and to innovate. A couple of institutions that rely heavily on highly skilled immigrants are places like UT Austin. 77% of the patents held by the UT system are actually held by a foreign-born resident. So these patents are generating millions and millions of dollars for the UT system and allowing all sorts of medical and other scientific innovations to happen. But if we don't keep our legal immigration system functioning as well, we're also running the risk of harming our economy. Another report from the Austin Commission on Immigrant Affairs, I believe 2 years ago, found that 1 out of every 4 startup founders in Austin is an immigrant. And that's considered by a lot of entrepreneurship think tanks a really major indicator of whether your city is going to be a thriving innovation hub, is how many immigrants do you have and how friendly are you to immigrants. So when you have laws like Senate Bill 4 pass, it makes it really difficult for immigrants of all backgrounds and legal status to live and contribute to the community, and it hurts all of us all around. But the other thing that I can share from a personal perspective is just a few months ago, the Texas Attorney General prompted a situation that resulted in the repeal of what's called the DACA program. And the DACA program is a program that I benefited from, which allowed undocumented young people to have a 2-year work permit, as well as a protection from deportation for 2 years at a time if they went through a background check, if they promised that they would either get a job or stay in school, and if they paid a fee of about $500. Over 100,000 DACA recipients live in Texas alone, and there's over 800,000 nationwide. And DACA was often considered by both political parties nationally as a kind of a line in the sand, that this is something that we're not going to mess with because this is protecting undocumented young people who were brought here as children and who are as American as people who were born here. Unfortunately, because the DACA program has been repealed, in March, over 10,000 people, starting in March, 10,000 people a day are going to fall out of status. This means 10,000 people a day are going to start losing their jobs. They're not going to know how to pay their bills. They're not going to know whether they can continue going to school. And so there is a law called the DREAM Act that we're going to talk about more in depth later, but just some economic statistics around the DREAM Act. If the DREAM Act were to pass, over 300,000 of those undocumented immigrants who live in Texas would be able to apply for it immediately, and they would be able to apply for a pathway to citizenship through that. And this is going to result in about $4 to $12 billion increase in the Texas GDP alone. So the idea is that even legal immigration, the points that I'm just trying to communicate is just the legal immigration system is breaking as well. And the DACA situation and the DREAM Act situation is an especially important one to keep in mind, because you have a bunch of young people, hundreds of thousands of young people who were educated in American institutions who you would not be able to know if you talk to me, you wouldn't be able to guess that I was undocumented for 24 years of my life. And we are putting them in a situation where they may be deported as early as March of next year.
I think since you brought up the DREAM Act, why don't we go ahead and tackle that issue, because it is top of mind at the federal level, and we are waiting and watching to see what Congress does. Faye, from your perspective on the DREAM Act, this is something that could have a huge impact on your clients, right?
In fact, it does have a huge impact on our client base and employers. Increasingly, on a daily basis, we get questions from employers, well, what do I do with this individual that we've hired? They're a valuable contributor to our organization. What happens when their employment authorization document runs out? And right now, there's a huge push. In fact, I think momentum is gaining in Congress this week and the following weeks before the year's end to come up with a solution for dreamers or for DACA recipients, for a permanent solution. And there are about 3 pieces of legislation out there. And I encourage all of you to take a look at them and take action with your congressional representatives, our congressional representatives, and those other key members of Congress who are supporting various pieces of legislation. Annie, I don't know, or Chris, if you have a particular opinion as to one or the other, but there's some bipartisan acts out there that I think really address some of the underlying issues. That aside, and I do want to continue the Dreamer discussion, we're in a time that is, in recent times, a little bit unprecedented in terms of how immigration policy is treated both in our state and at a national level. And pieces of legislation like SB4 or amplifier legislation is an amplifier piece of legislation for what's happening at a national level right now with various executive orders that impact us nationally. And I think we can take a look at the lens of the national immigration debate through pieces of legislation like SB 4.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we go ahead and tackle a little bit of SB 4 since it is now the law of the land in Texas. I'm assuming, people would on the surface go, well, I bet that that group, the Texas Association of Business, would be not arguing against SB 4, but indeed, this is something that unites all of you guys. Is that you did testify against SB 4. It will have an impact, as I understand it, on the economy in Texas in a very big way. So it's kind of a double whammy, as you said, Faye. We have the federal travel ban and the DREAM Act up for grabs, and then we have this SB 4. So we're seeing this from so many different angles. And it sounds like the immigration system wasn't exactly going well before. It sounds like the system was a little bit broken, and now this has been a big challenge. So let's talk about SB 4 a bit.
So this was the 85th session, in our opinion, was probably, in our opinion, the most anti-business, the most anti-immigration, the most anti-law enforcement, the most anti-Hispanic, eminent domain economic development incentives session that we've seen in our state's history. That was our last session that we just completed, as well as the special session. And Judy, to your point, SB 4 played a big part of that. Your state Chamber of Commerce, TAB, was against SB 4 from day one. We testified against SB 4, particularly the last minute amendment of show me your papers is absurd. It places our law enforcement, particularly local law enforcement, county law enforcement, even state law enforcement, in a very tricky situation to become ICE agents. They're not trained for that. And I think most law enforcement officials will tell you today that that is not their job. They do not want it to be their job. So whether you're a faith-based leader, whether you're in law enforcement, whether you're in business, the list goes on and on, city officials, et cetera, SB 4 is, again, a piece of unnecessary legislation that was unfortunately passed. In both chambers, it was signed by the governor. So now what do we do? Obviously, we're awaiting a court decision, and I'll let my other panelists speak on that, who are more experts than I am in that area. But as far as a business impact, SB 4 will continue to have a business impact on our state. It really tarnishes our brand, and we want to make sure that we move forward and make sure that there are no other pieces of legislation in the interim that are being considered for the 86th session that would be similar to this in other areas that would further tarnish the state brand. That's what other states are facing in terms of this type of frivolous legislation that is not meaningful, and particularly when it comes to the business community. So yes, we were on the side. I think a lot of people assume that TAB was for SB 4, and that was simply not the case.
Faye and Annie, do you want to weigh in on SB 4 and its impact?
Yeah, so SB 4, I worked on a lot of campaigns that happened right as the law was being passed. And really how it's being framed is it's our North Carolina bathroom bill moment. And that, of course, was a really, when North Carolina passed their version of the bathroom bill, it resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of divestment from the state. And I think the kind of divestment you're going to see as a result of SB 4 will be slightly different. It may be some companies saying, I'm not going to set up shop in Texas, but it may also be industries that really rely on immigrant labor, such as agriculture, hurting pretty badly because people aren't going to show up to work. And things like this have already been happening. One of the pieces of SB 4 that a lot of people don't know about is that it basically requires it requires mandatory compliance with any request from ICE, not just around what's called detainers. So this means that there's the possibility if ICE wanted to do an operation in Austin and they wanted to arrest, let's say, 100 Dreamers who fell out of status as a result of the DACA program being canceled, they could call Austin Police Department and say, we need your help picking up these young people, and the Austin Police Department is legally required to help them carry out this operation. And when we say it applies to law enforcement, it also applies to law enforcement on college campuses. And again, historically, that was kind of a line in the sand that ICE would not carry out operations on college campuses. But we are in a situation where it's possible ICE could call UTPD and say, again, we're looking for these 100 people who have fallen out of status as a result of the DACA program being canceled, and UTPD would have to cooperate, go to these people's dorms, or assist in any kind of operation that they need to carry out. So in addition to just the economic impact of a law like this, which is being considered by national outlets as the most draconian immigration law in the country, there's also this implication of the community that we live in. Do we want to live in cities where ICE can just come in and kind of take over your police department and make them an extension of some kind of an enforcement force, some kind of a deportation force?
So Faye, and I will get to some audience questions once Faye weighs in on this, because I know that you have a unique perspective because you're representing people who are directly impacted by this legislation.
That's right. So here's my copy of SB 4. I literally have carried around with me since the end of the legislative session. It's well worn and well written on. I had a recent chance to listen to the oral arguments with the Fifth Circuit. They're available online if you want to listen to them. But the summary of SB 4, sort of where we're at right now, is that on August 30th, the U.S. District Judge in San Antonio, Judge Orlando Garcia, enjoined several parts of the bill. He enjoined the provision that requires jail officials to honor all immigration detainers, which is a very specific provision under law that says if someone is arrested, for probable cause, and immigration runs a check on them, that they can make a request to local jails to hold that individual for up to 48 hours. That request is voluntary, and it's not based on a warrant for a judge, and that's important because that's part of one of the challenges of SB4 and its constitutionality, whether or not detainers are constitutional. The second part is that the judge blocks sections that prohibit local entities from pursuing a pattern or practice that materially limits enforcement of immigration laws. And that's important because it's very broad, and a lot of the discussion that's going on right now in the appeal is whether or not that's a violation of First Amendment rights of local officials, elected officials, and county officials, and local localities to, be able to publicly or privately even just, have an opinion as to what is going to happen, or how their local government is going to operate within the context of immigration. The third part is that there are other provisions of SB4 that prohibit assisting or cooperating with federal immigration officers that Annie also spoke about that were initially enjoined. And the fourth part that was also enjoined by the Judge Garcia was that the part that prevented local governments from adopting, enforcing, or endorsing a policy. It blocked that provision. Now, what happened after that decision was made to temporarily enjoin SB4 is that it was challenged up to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit essentially said, you know what, there's large parts of this we're not going to enjoin of SB4. So when we say it's the law of the land, it's not the final law of the land. We don't have a final decision yet on SB4, and we don't know how that's going to turn out. The oral arguments were interesting, because I think that there may be parts of the bill that may move forward because there's going to be constitutional challenges that are not facial but are going to be as applied, meaning we'll have to see, sort of constitutional violations that occur. One of the parallels I just wanted to mention, before moving on was that SB4, and I think, Chris, you'd be better to speak on this than I would, but the parallels to the SB 1070 in Arizona. The bills are similar, not the same, but I think the effect on our economy and how this will generally play out in the federal courts will be very similar insofar as we're going to have lots of litigation that will go on for a long time. In the Arizona case, what happened is it ultimately got settled out in federal mediation over the course of years, but at the expense to the economy, where it was considered a pariah, the expense of taxpayers who had to pay lots and lots of money, to defend that bill in court. No, it's not there.
Well, I do want to get to some audience questions. Julie, do we have some audience questions?
Yeah, we have quite a few, and from a lot of different perspectives. And the first theme that I want to hit on is this curiosity around some of the negative impacts of immigration. So a lot of audience members saying, I hear what you're saying about the economy. What are some of the things that we do need to keep in mind as we form opinions around this, support it? What are some of the things, the pieces of immigration that might be negative that we just need to keep in mind?
One, I think you can look at the broader picture that if you just look at SB4, it really undermines the community trust. It would drive victims, perhaps witnesses, into the shadows. They're not going to be willing to work with police officers to identify crimes, to make criminal activity known that they may be aware of. So I think we've got to look at that as well outside of the economics of it. The economic picture is very real. There are a lot of our industries, as we've noted on this panel earlier, that rely on immigrant workers and a lot on undocumented immigrant workers. Services that you and I use every single day, that undocumented immigrant workers provided that service for us. So outside of the economy part of it, the overall community trust, the overall do we want to live in a state, do we want to live in a community that is forced to take on laws and forced to enforce laws that are simply unnecessary in terms of how we operate each and every day?
Anybody else want to tackle that one before we move on to our next question?
So I would say that I think I understand what the question is saying in terms of, we've talked about the positives of immigration, but what are some of the negatives? And instead of, I think that you kind of need to turn that question around a little bit and talk about how the immigration system is broken, so it's not functioning as it should. And when you have such a massive system that has been critical to the economic and cultural evolution of this country not functioning as it should, there's a lot of negative implications. But economists overwhelmingly agree that when you have an immigration system that is able to bring in the kinds of people that the economy needs and also allow for some level of family reunification, that is a huge positive across the board for the country. And a lot of these things that you might hear on the news about things like sanctuary cities or immigrants not paying taxes or things like that, those are not true, right? Like, at the end of the day, a lot of this information is misinformation. Even in Texas, SB4 was passed because there was this idea that we had all these cities that weren't cooperating with ICE. But not a single city, with the exception of Austin, actually had a policy on the books that minimized cooperation with ICE. And as a matter of fact, since the election, over 18 counties have signed up for a voluntary federal program that will increase the amount of access ICE has to local jails. And one of those counties is actually Williamson, right up north. So the idea that there was some kind of situation happening in Texas where all these dangerous immigrants who were, being accused of horrible violent crimes were just roaming the streets, that was just untrue. And a really big reason people end up undocumented is not because they don't want to do the right thing or come here legally. It's because there are no pathways to legalization, and because the way the system has been breaking down is leaving more and more people undocumented. So when we talk about the negative implications of immigration, we also have to remember that we are living in a moment where the system has completely broken. So a lot of those implications could be fixed just by legalizing millions and millions of immigrants.
Would you agree with that, Faye, when the question is about the negative implications of immigration?
I'd like to be thoughtful about it because how we approach immigration is not a one-sided issue. There's a lot of debate that can occur, and there's a lot of thoughtful discussion that can occur about the fixes to our immigration system. And we have to be able to engage each other with that on either side of the aisle. Right now, the topic is so divisive, publicly and with peers and amongst colleagues, that it's almost like you can't move forward. But the one thing I think everyone can agree on, where we can start, is that our immigration system is broken. And bills at the state level, at local levels, exacerbate and they don't fix the problem. And so when you approach the topic, I think we have to kind of start from there. And, and I don't disagree at all with what Annie said.
Another question from the audience.
Yes, quite a few. So in terms of what can we do along the lines of a broken system, how do we make it easier to get visas? Is that what we should be doing? Should we be welcoming everyone? What should that look like?
Faye, you might want to start with that one from a legal perspective.
Sure. From a legal perspective, I think, we should have a system that is able to process immigrants who are either coming here temporarily or permanently in an orderly fashion that meets the demands of business right now, and also the concerns of family unification. That's how our system is currently built, and there's debate as to what that should look like, or whether we do one more than the other. But right now, our system doesn't do that. In terms of, do we increase visas? Right now, we're living in an era where there are no changes in regard to, lawful immigration and temporary visas. There are no changes to the law. No laws have been made. But yet, on a weekly basis, we are faced as immigration attorneys, as advocates, with changes to the immigration law that happen via policy, that happen via memorandum, sometimes unpublished and sometimes after the fact, where all of a sudden you're like, what? Why all of a sudden am I getting all of these requests for further evidence? We have an administration who's saying we will no longer defer to the prior approvals of, approval notices of non-immigrant visas, and we're going to re-adjudicate everything. They're making changes to the, Department of State adjudication of visas. Immigration is so complex. It's not just the government. It's many agencies. It's U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, it's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, it's the U.S. Department of State, it's the U.S. Department of Labor, all of these things working in tandem to get someone here. And so there's not a super easy solution. We need comprehensive immigration reform. Without that, you have any administration on either side, right, Republican or Democrat, making changes, nibbling, trying to make the fix, but without a permanent solution, and that's what we need. We need that for the Dreamers now, but even if we get that for the Dreamers, we cannot forget that we need comprehensive immigration reform.
I want to drill down to some personal stories because I think that we can all relate to individuals. Annie, would you mind sharing the personal story that you went through, and you and your family?
So I moved here when I was 2 years old from Pakistan with my mom, my dad, and my sister. And like I said, it took us 24 years to get permanent residency. And in those 24 years, we were trying to pursue one option after another every single day that we were here. We first went through what's called the H-1B system because my dad is an electrical engineer. And the H-1B system is a highly used visa from tech companies that especially allows us to hire engineers and highly qualified STEM professionals. Unfortunately, while we were in the process of the H-1B system, September 11th happened, and the immigration system was literally shut down. And when it reopened, there were a lot of changes to that as a result of, taking increased national security measures. And there were some changes made to the H-1B system. So once that became a dead end for my family, we decided to apply for asylum because my family is part of a religious community in Pakistan that is highly persecuted. And every single member of my family has left Pakistan and either lives in Texas or Canada at this point. And the persecution of our religious group is it's really well documented by human rights agencies around the world. So my family knew that when we were moving here, it wasn't just because, we wanted to move here. We knew it was because there was no future for for people who were part of that community in a country like Pakistan. In Pakistan, my family can't vote. They would be living in fear of violence and prosecution under Pakistan's really notorious blasphemy laws, which target Christians and other kind of religious minorities. And so my family knew that if there was any future for my sister and I, it would not be in Pakistan, unfortunately. So when I was in college, we were going through our asylum case, and I was a sophomore here at UT Austin. And again, because our immigration system, as Faye was saying, relies a lot on, these days, on really arbitrary policy changes, one of the policy changes that has happened in the last few years is that ICE has an incredible amount of discretion on who they go after. And even though my family didn't really meet the criteria of what was called the enforcement criteria, meaning no criminal record, we had very strong ties to the community, 2 college-educated young daughters, and all that kind of stuff, ICE chose to put us in removal proceedings. So this means that when I was a sophomore at UT, I was, starting to think about my future and what I wanted to do in terms of my career, but all that came to an end because they gave us a date and they said, you have to leave this country by this date. Fortunately, we fought that case, and our asylum case was reheard this August. And it was adjudicated successfully, so we were finally on the pathway to citizenship. But it did take 10 years, and of those 10 years, 7 of those were in deportation proceedings. So the amount of stress and anxiety and all those kinds of things that put on my family, I can't understate that. But I also can't understate that there are millions of people who don't have the option that my family had, which was to apply for asylum. And there's 11 million people here in this country who, without a legal status, and millions of undocumented young people like myself who were raised here, and again, who are indistinguishable from any other American young person, who don't have these options. And so one of the laws that we actually have the momentum and the opportunity and the window to pass before the end of the year is the DREAM Act. And that would give a couple of million people an opportunity to be put on this pathway to legalization. So, by sharing my story, one of the things I want to reflect is, one, how complicated and broken the immigration system is, even if you have the resources and the opportunity to try to pursue citizenship. And two, just to remind you all that there's millions of people who just don't have that option at all.
The resources.
Yeah.
The resources, yeah. Chris, from your perspective, what are some of the individual businesses you represent telling you about immigration reform and immigration laws that have been passed recently? How is that impacting them?
Yeah. Comprehensive immigration reform, as stated, is needed. You can walk within 3 blocks of this beautiful building where we are sitting today. And you have companies right here in Austin that are impacted by the H-1B visa system. They need highly skilled workers. They need more of them. So we have to increase that number, for one. You have many investors in our state and our city right here that benefit from the EB-5 program, where they make significant investment. Foreign nationals make significant investment into our economy here, and in return, they are granted
And Chris, could you
visa.
elaborate on, what is EB-5?
So EB-5 is where you make a certain amount of foreign investment if you're a foreign national into the United States, and in return for that, you meet a specified quality criteria, and in return, you would receive a visa, you and your family, for instance, depending on your level of investment and how much you maintain that investment over a certain period of time. It's a great program. It's come under fire. Yes, there are some parts of the program that need to be fixed, but as noted earlier, there are many parts of our immigration system that are broken, that need to be fixed. Just the time element alone. If you look at the amount of time that it takes for a U.S. citizen, if they're married to a citizen of a foreign country, how long it takes them to apply and be approved, if they're approved, of a spouse visa. 3 years minimum. 3 years minimum. So this impacts employers, this impacts their workforce, employees all over our entire country, particularly right here in Texas. We simply have to have the workers. So no matter how you feel about sanctuary cities, SB4, obviously securing our borders, which we're all for, we simply have to have the workers. If we did not have the immigrant workers, legal and illegal, our economy would not be simply what it is today.
Faye, share some personal stories from your clients. I know you can't violate attorney-client privilege, but in general, business and individual clients, what are some of the barriers and obstacles?
Sure. I'm going to kind of put together 2 scenarios, one on sort of the family-based immigration process and one on the employment-based immigration process, because we've all touched upon that. The H-1B visa is a great visa. It's for specialty occupation workers, so people who have a minimum of a bachelor's degree in a related field, and an employer sponsors them to come work. And so the typical H-1B story goes like this. We have a student who came to study their bachelor's degree or master's degree in the United States from a foreign country. They graduate from a U.S. college or institution, and then they're eligible for something called optional practical training, which is like a 1-year internship. And oftentimes an employer then may say, hey, this electrical engineer, this chemical engineer, this teacher, they're valuable. We want to sponsor them because we can't fill their role. And so they go through the H-1B lottery system. And the H-1B, there's more demand for the H-1B visa than there are visas available. And so what happens is every year on April 1st, everyone kind of gets in line, applies for their visa, and then there are more applicants than there are visas available. So in years past, we've had, I think at its peak, there was 232,000 applicants for, under 65,000 visas available. So it kind of tells you the percentage, right? And what happens under the law is that then it becomes a lottery process. So everyone who applies and gets everything properly submitted then goes into a lottery system, and you kind of wait. So let's say you're that individual with a master's degree and you don't get the H-1B visa. What's your option? Well, you have 60 days and then you have to go home or try to find some other status if possible, but the options are limited. Let's say that same person though gets lucky and gets selected for the lottery. Well, at some point, there's a 6-year cap on that H-1B visa, and an employer at that point needs to decide whether or not they want to sponsor them to become a lawful permanent resident. And in order to do that, they have to typically go through something called a labor certification process, which is basically a test of the U.S. job market to see if there are any qualified or U.S. willing workers for the position. It's a complicated process. It's easy to misstep. You have to run ads, you have to get prevailing wages, you have to be able to, prove that you can meet the wage. You have to advertise, and if there is a qualified U.S. worker, the process stops. If anywhere along the way it's audited or denied, process stops. And that person, what happens? H-1B visa comes up to the cap, got to go home. Let's say you get that labor certification approved. Then what? It may take from that point, depending on your visa category, anywhere from 2 years to 20 years to get your lawful permanent residency, depending on where you were born. Visa categories are very backlogged. When people talk about the line, what they're talking about is the visa bulletin and the long wait for lawful permanent residency. You have people at the same time in the family-based context who apply for their family members. Let's say, this is particularly true, backlogged in Mexico and Filipinos and different nationalities where you emigrate, you're a lawful permanent resident, you apply for your child. That wait's going to be years. Maybe that child ages out. Then the wait becomes 25 years. So you have a family trying to follow the process. And anywhere along the way, things can be revoked. You may not get notice. The case may be denied. Or during that wait, just because you have an initial process started, you're not protected from removal. So you may be deported. The process is slow, the process is broken, and the waits are long. And over time, what we have seen are employers deciding, especially recently, I don't know if I want to go through this process. It's really complicated. It's really expensive. Maybe it's best, maybe I outsource. Maybe for the larger companies, maybe, we move our operations for these engineers to another country. Maybe an individual graduate says, you know what, it's not worth the 20 years. I'm going to go ahead and go to Canada. I'm going to go to the UK. I'm going to go to some place where I feel like my education and my innovation will be valued, by that country or that immigration process. And for families, the process is just as difficult because the choices are not economic, but it's, do I want to be separated or do I want to be with my family? How do I make this process work? And you see families torn apart under the current immigration system, especially where there's no discretion by ICE, and it's heartbreaking. You see children subject to mandatory detention. You see mothers and fathers separated from their children. We have such a short time, but there's so much to discuss about, what's going on and, how we approach it. But I'll stop.
One of the best descriptions I've ever heard.
Yes, thank you. That really does personalize it. And I know this is your work every single day. I think we have time for one more quick audience question before we do our call to action, Julie.
So as a closing question from the audience, as we're working through policy and legislation, we have several questions about how do we protect people right now? What are the things that we can be doing while we're working out the policy pieces? What are the resources out there?
Good question.
And what are some of the things that we can be doing?
Yeah, let's run through some of the ways we can support these folks who are kind of in limbo. Do you want to start, Annie?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because as a lot of these policies just get changed at the drop of a hat, it becomes harder and harder to protect people. But I would say supporting local immigrant rights organizations is an easy thing that you can all do because A lot of these organizations like Grassroots Leaderships are running community programs for people who do end up caught in the deportation dragnet. One of the local organizations that does great work is also the Workers' Defense Project. They really did a lot of campaigning around this girl named Rosa Maria recently, who was I believe she was 12 years old and had cerebral palsy and had gallbladder surgery. And when she woke up from gallbladder surgery, she was handcuffed to a bed and then immediately taken to a detention center because she was an undocumented 12-year-old. So they did a lot of work to raise money for her and her family and to get ICE to release her. But supporting these organizations will help you, will show you the kinds of campaigns they're working on and the people in your community affected by these situations. Because that's something that we always need more support around is these deportation campaigns. I think as we see more and more DACA recipients unfortunately lose status and lose their income and their economic livelihood, there's probably resources we can be developing in the community to provide them with things like rent assistance or things like that, or even tuition assistance, because it's like a very unprecedented situation that you had people who are here given some kind of lawful, presence, and they are now being pulled back into the shadows. So I think that is a community that will always need some kind of financial, but also your political support.
It's really time for our call to action.
Yeah.
We'd like to end each of these engaged breakfasts with an actionable way that people in the audience can weigh in and engage on this issue right here in our own community. So, Faye, I'm going to ask you to begin with a call to action for our audience today.
1, call your local representatives about the Dreamers now, today, when you leave, and keep calling. Even after the holiday season, even after the break, if they don't do something, we need a solution. 2, even with the solution, remember that we need to continue the push for comprehensive immigration reform. That fight has been going on since pre-2001, and it needs to happen. Be informed. Have open hearts and open minds, especially in this holiday season. Look at our community members and understand that you don't know what their immigration status is. You can't possibly know by looking at someone, and that we have enough room at the table for everyone to participate in our economy, in our homes, in our churches, and to be together. That's it. Call your reps, be informed, and be open to possibility.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I want to take it just one step further. On your table today, you have a piece called "The Record" for the record. That is our scorecard of how state legislators scored in this last session. SB 4 is part of that. So be looking, when you go to the voting box, be looking at that scorecard if you're passionate about this issue, and look how your representative, your state representative, your senator who represents you where you live voted on this issue and other business-related issues as well. 2, when you go back to your place of work, when you go back to church, your neighborhood associations, other civic groups that you belong to, have forums like this, and ask your HR departments and ask other civic organizations for the powerful stories like Annie's to come forward, DACA Dreamers to come forward and tell their story. Most companies in the U.S. are going to be impacted by a decision on DACA. 72% of the top 25 Fortune 500 companies count DACA recipients among their employees. 72% of the top 25 Fortune 500 companies, so the top 25 of the Fortune 500 have DACA employees. So what if they were to come out and be known that they are impacted by DACA? What a powerful story and testimony that would be shared with other employees, C-suite executives, to have a call to action, to call one of our 36 House members and 2 senators who all do a great job in representing Texas in D.C. on our behalf.
Finally, Annie.
Yeah, it's a mix of everything that's said already. Call your representatives first and foremost about the DREAM Act. It is something that can get done, and it needs to get done before the members of Congress leave at the end of the month. And the reason it needs to get done before the end of the month is really important, because sometimes when you call, they'll say, we can do it next year. And it needs to get done now, because whenever they do it, it'll take a few months for them to roll out the applications. And in that time, every single day, thousands of people are going to fall out of status. Thousands of companies are going to have to fire their employees. And our local communities and our local economy is going to suffer as a result. So please call your congressperson about passing the DREAM Act before they leave at the end of the month. The second thing is definitely stay informed and keep the conversation going. There's a lot of things that you'll find out just by keeping track of immigration in the news. So for example, grassroots leadership is known for working on issues of deportation and also detention. And there's a law that Congress passed a few years ago that says the country must have 32,000 detention beds for immigrants available at any given time. This law is basically creating a situation where people are incentivized to put immigrants in jail without due process, or to put them in immigration detention without due process. So when you find out that you'll see about how Texas is kind of at the heart of this detention situation. So stay informed and keep the conversation going. And then third, I think voting for the right candidates on both sides of the aisle is so critical. There's going to be a lot of seats up for election next year, and you should know who to vote for, pro-immigrant, pro-business candidates on both sides of the aisle.
Annie, Chris, and Faye, thank you for sharing your perspective, your expertise, for being on the front lines on this issue, and for your passion for this topic. I think you've really educated and inspired all of us today, and we really appreciate it.